The 1970s in United States was a decade wrapped in shag carpet, wood-paneled walls, and the warm glow of a television set that never seemed to turn off. But behind the bright colors and catchy theme songs, there was a quiet current of fear running through the childhood of an entire generation. This wasn't the polished, filtered world of today. It was raw, uncertain, and often frightening. For American kids growing up in that era, fear didn't come from fictional jump scares alone. It came from the news, from the classroom drills, from the gas station signs, from milk cartons, and from the simple realization that the world outside their front door felt unstable. The terror was real, and it shaped how they saw life, safety, and even adulthood. One of the biggest shadows hanging over every American child in the 1970s was the lingering fear of nuclear war. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union wasn't just political tension discussed by adults. It seeped into classrooms and playground conversations. Kids were taught about atomic bombs the way they were taught multiplication tables. They practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks as if a thin piece of wood could shield them from a nuclear blast. Sirens were not abstract sounds. They were warnings. The idea that at any moment the sky could light up in a blinding flash and everything would end was a concept children tried to process with young minds. Television news showed missile tests, political standoffs, and grim-faced leaders. Movies and discussions about doomsday scenarios made it feel close. Even though the Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred in the 1960s, its aftershock lived on in the 70s psyche. The word nuclear was terrifying, and children absorbed that fear without fully understanding geopolitics. Another deeply unsettling presence in the 1970s was the rise of serial killers and highly publicized violent crimes. Names like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy were splashed across newspapers and evening broadcasts. For the first time, media coverage made these criminals into household names. Kids overheard adults whispering about bodies found in neighborhoods that looked just like theirs. Parents became more protective. Don't talk to strangers wasn't casual advice. It was a command fueled by real horror stories. The concept that evil could wear a friendly face, that danger could be driving a van down your street, planted seeds of anxiety in young minds. Then there were the child abductions that gripped the nation. The disappearance of Etan Patz in 1979 shook parents across the country. His face became one of the first widely recognized missing children images, eventually appearing on milk cartons in the 1980s. But the fear began in the late 70s. Children began to realize they were vulnerable. Walking home alone, playing outside until sunset, riding bikes across neighborhoods, things that once symbolized freedom, started to carry an invisible risk. Fear crept into everyday life. The 1970s also brought economic instability that children felt even if they didn't understand inflation or oil embargoes. The 1973 oil crisis, triggered by OPEC's embargo, led to gas shortages and long lines at stations. The OPEC embargo created scenes that kids watched from the backseat of cars as their parents waited anxiously for fuel. Gas rationing, odd even license plate days, and sudden price hikes made the future seem uncertain. When parents were stressed about money, children felt it. Layoffs, rising prices, and recession turned dinner table conversations serious. The American dream didn't look as guaranteed as it once had. Fear wasn't just about survival. It was about stability. Schools in the 1970s also became places of tension due to desegregation and busing policies following court decisions like those stemming from Supreme Court of the United States rulings. While integration was a necessary and historic step toward equality, the transition was turbulent in many cities. Protests, clashes, and community anger were shown on television. Children were caught in the middle of adult conflict, sometimes literally riding buses into neighborhoods where they weren't welcomed. The confusion and hostility were frightening. It was a decade where societal change was happening rapidly, and kids often experienced the emotional fallout. Television itself, ironically the main source of comfort, was also a source of fear. Shows and public service announcements were not always gentle. Emergency broadcast system tests would suddenly interrupt programming with a loud tone and a stark message that made hearts race. Horror films like The Exorcist and Halloween became cultural phenomena. Even if children weren't allowed to watch them, they heard about them at school. The imagery, the rumors, the exaggerated playground retellings were enough to create nightmares. The 1975 film Jaws turned the ocean into a place of dread. Suddenly, swimming at the beach wasn't just summer fun. It was a potential death sentence in a child's imagination. Sharks became monsters lurking beneath every wave. Environmental disasters added another layer of anxiety. Incidents like the Love Canal contamination, though more publicly exposed later, reflected a growing awareness that the environment itself could be dangerous. Industrial pollution, smog in cities, and rivers catching fire, like the Cuyahoga River in 1969, lingered in public consciousness. Kids learned that even the air and water might not be safe. Then there was the fear surrounding cults and mass tragedies. The horrifying 1978 events in Jonestown, led by Jim Jones, where over 900 people died in a mass murder-suicide, stunned the nation. News coverage showed images and details that were deeply disturbing. For children trying to understand how something so catastrophic could happen, the world suddenly seemed unpredictable in a new way. Authority figures weren't automatically trustworthy. Leaders could be dangerous. Trust itself felt fragile. Urban legends thrived in the 1970s because they fed into real anxieties. Stories about razor blades and Halloween candy spread like wildfire. Whether verified or exaggerated, they changed behavior. Parents inspected treats carefully. Kids wondered if a simple act of trick-or-treating could be deadly. The line between myth and reality blurred, and fear flourished in that gray area. Even playground equipment was more dangerous. Metal slides scorching hot under summer sun, minimal safety standards, and little supervision. Injuries were common, and safety culture wasn't what it is today. News about plane hijackings during the 1970s also contributed to a sense of vulnerability. Air travel, which had once symbolized glamour, became associated with danger. The idea that someone could take over a plane mid-air was terrifying. Though children might not have flown often, they saw the headlines and sensed adult fear. Political scandals shook confidence in leadership as well. The Watergate scandal and the resignation of Richard Nixon in 1974 marked the first time a U.S. president left office in disgrace. For kids, it was confusing. Presidents were supposed to be heroes. Seeing one fall shattered a kind of innocence about authority. If the most powerful man in the country could lie and break the law, what did that mean about the world's structure? Fear wasn't always explosive. It was sometimes subtle and existential. Even pop culture carried strange unease. The late-night television sign-offs, static screens, and the national anthem playing before broadcast shutdown created an eerie atmosphere. When the TV went dark, silence filled the room in a way modern 24/7 streaming audiences can't imagine. Darkness felt deeper. The world felt smaller and more isolated. There were also fears tied to health. The swine flu scare of 1976 led to a nationwide vaccination campaign. News about potential pandemics being alone. Many children in the 1970s were latchkey kids. With more mothers entering the workforce, kids often came home to empty houses. Letting themselves in, hearing unfamiliar noises, watching shadows stretch across the living room. These everyday moments could feel terrifying. Independence came early, but so did anxiety. The imagination filled gaps with worst-case scenarios. All of these fears combined into a unique psychological landscape. American kids in the 1970s grew up faster in some ways. They were exposed to adult realities without filters. News wasn't softened. Conversations weren't always shielded. They absorbed the weight of a nation navigating political distrust, economic strain, global tension, and social transformation. Yet here's the powerful truth. Despite all that terror, they endured. The same kids who hid under desks during nuclear drills went on to build careers, raise families, and drive innovation. The same children who feared strangers became parents who created safer communities. Fear shaped them, but it did not break them. In fact, it may have strengthened their resilience. Because when you grow up believing the world could end at any moment, you learn to value the present. When you see institutions fail, you learn to question and improve them. When you witness instability, you crave stability and work to build it. The 1970s were not just a decade of disco and denim. They were a crucible of anxiety that forged a generation capable of adapting to uncertainty. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside the fear. Every generation faces its monsters. For 1970s American kids, those monsters were nuclear shadows, masked killers, political lies, economic chaos, and urban legends whispered in the dark. But they survived. They adapted. They learned courage not because fear was absent, but because fear was constant. If this deep dive into the hidden fears of the 1970s opened your eyes or brought back memories, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with someone who grew up in that era, and leave a comment telling us what scared you the most as a kid.